Hello photographers, today I'm going to show you how to nail exposure using manual mode for perfect photos. There are two things you have to think about when trying to nail exposure when shooting in manual mode. The first is the exposure itself, meaning how much light you actually capture for the photo. The second is how the photo looks, which includes things like depth of field, noise, and motion blur. All of these concerns are addressed through setting your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings. Now what I'm not going to do here is tell you what settings to use. Photography doesn't work that way. Every shooting situation is unique, and you as a photographer have a unique vision that you are trying to execute in your photos. Instead, we're going to talk about the process, because if you have a solid process, then no matter what situation you find yourself shooting in, you'll be able to nail your exposure and get the perfect photo. The process works like this. To start, you have to determine which of your settings is the most important to the success of the photo. Typically, you're choosing between aperture and shutter speed, and it breaks down to a pretty simple question. Is my subject still or moving? If the subject is still, then the aperture is your principal setting because you probably want to control the depth of field in the photo. If the subject is moving, then shutter speed is your principal setting because your primary concern is going to be freezing the action to get a sharp photo of your subject, or capturing the motion blur if you want motion. Once you've chosen your principal settings, we can work through the process, which we're going to do next. But before we do, I wanted to let you know that I turned this whole process into free printable manual mode flowcharts that you can download and print so you can work through this entire process while you're out shooting. So we're going through this example with a still subject, meaning the aperture is going to be our principal setting for the process. With a still subject, we're primarily concerned with depth of field, so the first thing we need to do is decide what aperture to use. We do that by deciding if we want great depth of field or shallow depth of field. If the answer is that you want shallow depth of field, then you will set your aperture to a smaller number, something like f1.8 or f3.5, or whatever the smallest aperture setting is for your lens. If you want greater depth of field where more stuff is in focus, then you're going to set your aperture to a smaller number like f11 or f16. For this example, we're going to go for shallower depth of field, so I'm going to set the aperture to the largest available opening for my lens, which is the smallest aperture setting, f2.8. After setting your aperture, you need to set your shutter speed. To do so, ask yourself if you want any motion blur in the image or not. If you do want motion blur, then the shutter speed should be around 1/30th of a second or longer. If you do not want motion blur, then the shutter speed should be at least 1 over the focal length of your lens. For my photo, I want a sharp photo. My focal length is 80 millimeters for this example, so I'll set my shutter speed to 1/80th. After setting your shutter speed, you need to set your ISO. Do this by pointing your camera at the subject and adjusting your ISO until the exposure indicator is at 0. For this example, we'll say the ISO is 800. Now, in some cases, you'll find that you can't get your exposure indicator to 0 by adjusting your ISO. When that happens, you'll have to adjust your shutter speed and or your aperture to compensate, and I've accounted for this in the flowchart. But you do have to be aware of your camera's limitations. Even though this process works, you may find yourself in a situation where you can't get a photo because of the limitations of your camera. That's most likely to happen when shooting in low light, and in those situations you can use a tripod or a flash to help, whatever is appropriate. Either way, once the exposure indicator is at 0, we take a test shot. The purpose of this shot is to evaluate the exposure. We know from my last couple of videos on metering that the camera doesn't really understand what you want your photo to look like, so you have to verify that your exposure looks the way you want it to look. In my case, I think it's a little too dark. So using the flowchart, I'm going to see if I can increase my ISO, which I can do, so I'll increase it by 1 stop. After you make your adjustments, you take another test photo and you need to check that exposure again. And in my case, the exposure now looks good. The next thing you need to check is to see if your image is sharp if you're going for that. In my case, again, in the example, it is. If it wasn't, you'd move back up to increase your shutter speed more and then work back down through the flowchart process. Finally, we check the depth of field. If that's good, then we can compose and take the photo. If it's not, and you need to go back up and adjust your aperture and work through the process again. And once you've worked your way through the process in the flowchart, you'll find yourself ready to take a photo, nailing the exposure and creating the best photo that you can under the circumstances you're shooting in. Now, this probably seems like a lot of steps to take, and in a way, it is. But that is part of the challenge of learning how to shoot in manual mode and learning how to control your camera. And that's exactly why I put this together into two different flowcharts for you to use while you learn and master the process. The first flowchart takes you through the process that I just detailed, where you use the aperture as your principal setting. And the second takes you through the same process, except using shutter speed as your principal setting. You can get those principal flowcharts at this link right here. And I have a question for you as well. Between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, what is your favorite setting and why? Let me know in the comments, which is also where you'll find my favorite setting and why it is my favorite setting. If you have any questions about any of this, leave a comment, and don't forget to like this video and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any of my videos, and then get out there and take some damn photos. Thank you for watching. Now, I get loads of questions and they all boil down to one thing, which is how do I make my camera do what I want it to do? And here's the thing, your camera is like an instrument, and you can't make music if you can't play your instrument. If you want to learn how to play your camera like the instrument it is, visit this link